Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with All Angles. Now, Joburg's inner city housing crisis and its overcrowded and unsafe buildings is back in the spotlight. This follows the death of over 70 people after a hijacked building caught fire on Tuesday morning in the Joburg CBD. Now, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa says the city needs to proactively improve conditions. For more on this, we are joined by Khululiwe Bhengu, who is the senior attorney at the Institute. Khululiwe, thank you very much for your time. Of course, I'm sure you heard, there's many times where we hear leaders of different political parties in disagreement, but where they agree is that your company and lawyers that represent companies such as yours are at fault, also have to take some of the blame for what happened yesterday, because they're saying every time they try to evict people and assist them in the, conditions that they live in poor conditions, that is, they are delayed by lawyers like yourselves. But of course, you're just following the law.
Thank you for having me. And it's very unfortunate that we're having this discussion at the loss of over 70 lives. I think putting a blame on organizations such as ourselves is actually putting the blame on the victim themselves, because we are lawyers who follow the law, who take instructions from desperate poor people who are almost out in the cold and just want to make sure that they do not end up homeless by an eviction. That to make sure that they have basic services in these buildings, to make sure that the state of this building do not further deteriorate than they already have because of the abandonment. So all we're doing is really to plead with the municipality to do right by its poorest residents.
And of course, your contention, your arguments, of course, in this case, would obviously be around that 1998 Act, prevention from unlawful or illegal eviction, right? But don't you think, as a lawyer, I mean, I just want to pick your brain here. Don't you think, as a lawyer, that that act in itself is problematic?
Definitely not. For me to say the act in itself is problematic, then we're saying the Constitution is problematic, because the Act of 1990, the PI Act, it comes directly from Section 26(3) of the Constitution, which prohibits arbitrary evictions without a court order. And that section of the Constitution takes it further and says that no law may permit these arbitrary evictions. So now to take issue with the Act is really taking issue with the Constitution and all the other rights that it safeguards. It's actually saying the right to housing is not important, because now it's an inconvenience, because now we have to go to court to do right by poor people. And it's not just the Act. The issue of the municipality having constitutional obligation to house poor evictees who would otherwise be homeless comes from the 20-year long jurisprudence from the Constitutional Court. I mean, the Constitutional Court is an institution that has been placed to safeguard the Constitution, and it has decided over the last 20 years that this is how evictions should be dealt with. This is how people's human rights should be safeguarded.
Well, we are a country that is evolving. Our constitution also, don't you agree, even the law needs to evolve. There are laws and acts that become bills, and they are, spoken about in Parliament. There's also panels that would discuss it right now. For instance, the country is looking at the amendment of the Electoral Act, which has been something that has been in effect for years now, and that is changing slowly. So don't you think that, not necessarily to say that people should be evicted, but now that we know that we have this crisis in our country, shouldn't a debate then come in of that particular act to try and upgrade it so that, the same people who need housing don't end up in the hands of very ruthless landlords who hijack these buildings and have them pay 1,500 Rand each to live 8 in a box?
I mean, it's an important process in a democratic country such as ourselves to constantly review our laws and try to improve them. But the review and updating of such laws cannot be regressive and take away from people's already existing constitutional rights. It should always seek to ensure that more rights are safeguarded where there's a loophole, something has not really been safeguarded. And that's what most laws that are being improved have tried to do. I don't think the issue is occupied. The issue in the inner city is with the municipality. We have seen in this particular building, it's owned by the municipality. They can't play victim and say we couldn't do anything. From what we understand, they knew the identities of these people who are extorting money from poor people. That's a separate process that they should have undertaken to make sure that these people are prosecuted, to come back and take charge of their building. If they take charge of their building where poor residents reside, as much as they do where medium and high income earners reside, then we wouldn't be in the situation, because there would be a caretaker, there would be security, there would be a bidding manager. All of these people are essential in ensuring that there is no fertile ground for hijackers to come into the building.
And so, you know, as a legal practitioner, where do you think the solution should be so that we don't find ourselves in a crisis like this one and in a tragedy of this magnitude again, you know, with government saying we were actually very close to sorting this building out. Just last week, we dealt with another building and took people to safer buildings in the inner city, and we were about to go to this building. But clearly, the process was too slow, and they're blaming the slowness of the process on people like yourselves.
I think that there's a number of solutions, but paramount amongst all of this is for the city to have a proper plan for affordable housing, for housing in the inner city for poor people, because this is how people end up in these buildings. If there was an alternative where a poor person can still access the city and not have to stay some 30 kilometers away from the city, then we wouldn't have people occupying unlawfully occupied buildings, and the evictions wouldn't be such a problem. At City just alone, we currently have about 28 active eviction cases, and in all of those cases, the municipality is a party, and they file the same reports over and over again and say, we don't have housing for poor people. You can imagine in those 28 cases dealt by Syria alone, if they had housing for those people, it's 28 buildings that can be fixed, that can then go to whatever private property owner to do whatever needs to happen. But we keep getting stuck where we are because never mind the fact that we have the Constitutional Court's judgment of Blue Moonlight that is over 10 years now that says you have the obligation. They still say we have nothing. And in the ones where they have, after being forced many times, provided alternative accommodation, they abandon the buildings. They do not maintain the buildings. We are constantly pleading with the city. There's no security. In one of the buildings where they put people in 2008. To this date, we have constant meeting with the city's human settlements. We inform them, people are coming in, we don't know who these people are. They're a threat to the building, they're a threat to the occupiers. Do something about the security, do something about the maintenance of the building. But if I were to take you to that building, you'd be shocked that it's a city-owned building.
I think I will contact you after you and I have spoken so you can take us to that building, because obviously this story needs to be taken forward. Thank you very much for your time here on eNCA. That was Khululiwe Bhengu. She is a senior attorney at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. So at the bottom line for them is housing for poor people. You find these problems in areas such as Alexandra as well. And that is the bottom line for them. Maybe give the buildings to private institutions to be able to refurbish them for better living conditions before just telling people to leave.